As we just asked Senator Elissa Slotkin, there is brand new reporting. It has broken since I've been on the air. It's in the New York Times, and it is about Maine's Democratic Senate candidate Graham Plattner. He's currently the frontrunner to become the Democratic challenger to Republican Senator Susan Collins in that pivotal midterm race in Maine. After news reports surfaced that he had sent explicit messages to women while he was married, several women came forward to the New York Times about their experiences with Plattner. From that new New York Times reporting, quote, in interviews with the New York Times on Wednesday, several women described Mr. Plattner as a fun and caring partner and said they felt safe with him. Some remain friends with him to this day, years after their relationships ended. But in extensive conversations over the past 2 months, 3 other women who had been romantically involved with Mr. Plattner offered a far more complicated assessment, describing volatile and toxic relationships that were unsettling and at times emotionally wrenching. Mr. Plattner could be charming and charismatic, they recalled in interviews, but also demeaning to women and, in at least one case, even physically threatening. He drank heavily and was regularly unfaithful. End quote. It's important to tell you, our viewers, that one of the 3 is a conservative activist who has worked on Republican campaigns, but she says that she would have spoken out even if Graham Plattner was a Republican candidate. She disputes Plattner's claim that he did not know that the tattoo on his chest was a Nazi symbol. From that part of this new reporting, quote, Mr. Plattner, she said, knew when they were dating years ago that the tattoo was a Nazi symbol and that he called it my Totenkopf. The Plattner campaign, quote, strongly disputes that claim that he knew about the tattoo and that he told her about it. Graham Plattner will be Chris Hayes' guest in his first national interview since this story broke this afternoon. That happens tonight at 8 o'clock on All In. For our coverage, I want to bring in political analyst and host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller, with me at the table. As I've been going through this story and this reporting, is my friend and colleague, our political analyst, Molly Jong-Fast. She's the host of Fast Politics and a New York Times contributing opinion writer. Tim Miller, I start with you.
Hey, look, Nicole, this is a complicated one, and it's ongoing, and so there's some elements to it. So I'll just kind of walk through what I think are the key parts. Number one, I think as Senator Slotkin said, look, any accusations of any type of inappropriate behavior around women should be taken seriously. And the Democrats have shown that they've taken it seriously in the past, whether that be Andrew Cuomo or Al Franken. And I think that the Democrats have credibility on this issue for a reason. In this story, it is only the one woman that was the Republican activist that makes any accusations of like him putting his hands on her. The other women don't say that. It's more just about kind of drinking and volatile behavior. And so, I think that the question is, like, what else could possibly come up? And I think that takes us to the political part of this. Like, just to do rank politics here, like, this is an extremely important Senate race for our democracy. The Democrats need to pick up 4 Senate seats to take over the Senate and to control Supreme Court nominations, to be able to control the floor for any nominations that Donald Trump wants to put forward for Attorney General or DNI or any important roles in his administration. Like, they have to, those cabinet officials ostensibly will have to be confirmed by the Senate. So taking over the Senate is very important, and winning the Senate, it's pretty hard to do without Maine. And you just look at the map, and North Carolina, Roy Cooper looks very good. A good poll in Ohio for Sherrod Brown. That's 2. Then you get into some pretty big red states. Iowa, the Democrats have a good candidate. Texas, Tellurico, Alaska, they have a good candidate. But those are all states Democrats haven't won in a long time. Democrats have won Maine the last 3 cycles. And all Democrats need to do to win Maine is nominate somebody that gets all of the Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris voters. And so it seems like kind of a silly place to take a big risk. And I think that is the strongest case against Plattner, whether you're a huge Plattner fan or a Plattner opponent. Like, I think there's a prudential question of, like, is this Senate race the place to take this type of risk? I do think the last thing I'd say is I get a little bit frustrated with this, and I'm sure some Plattner fans do as well, with like all of the focus on these things that he's done in the past as compared to what Susan Collins has done as an actual senator. And the tattoo thing in particular, I just feel it's incumbent to mention that regardless of what you think about his tattoo, which he covered up, he's not proposing any Nazi-like policies. And Susan Collins was the chair of the Appropriations Committee when we sent people to a foreign gulag based on their race and based on the tattoos they have. So I'm not here to say that that was a Nazi policy, but it's certainly a heck of a lot closer than anything that Graham Plattner is proposing. And so I just do think that is also important to have in the discussion here. Like, Susan Collins controlled the power of the purse, allegedly, at the Senate. If she was such a moderate, she could have stopped that. And she could have said, we're not going to fund this administration as long as they're sending innocent people to a foreign torture prison based on their tattoo. She didn't do that. And so I do get a little bit frustrated when these conversations kind of frame her up as some moderate, when she's been totally complicit in some very fascistic behavior, tattoo-related behavior by this administration.
I want to thank you for your clarity and your courage and sort of seeing this and being able to shove it through a sieve of the substance of what is accused and the stakes of the election. I mean, I think that's the whole thing. And I guess all I would add is, we are not the arbiters of anything, right? It is our job to bring forth the reporting. Maine Democrats will decide, I think, on Tuesday night, do they want to represent them. And then the broader population of Maine will decide, do they want to represent them in Congress. But I think Tim just framed up the choices on both those fronts pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to talk about, this is about what the person will do in the Senate. I did think what Slotkin said was also really important. You know, violence is a no-go. And remember, this is a person who will, ultimately be in the Senate making judgment calls. And if it's a person who drinks heavily and has personality changes, I'm sober 28 and a half years. And I think that if there's a substance issue here, that's a big deal. And, we have seen Democrats, I just think releasing the moral high ground. And again, obviously, this is up to the voters of Maine, and this election is so important. But I do think also what has been good about Democrats is that they've had, they haven't said, well, like, this guy's really popular, so we're going to let, like what Republicans did with Trump. And so I do think it's a tough moment, but I do agree, like, the Senate map is critical, and Donald Trump is a president who is totally out of control, and Republicans have shown they have no interest in checking his power.
Tim, what do you say to people who look at all of the attention we have justifiably and perhaps belatedly given to the Epstein accusers and want to understand how this story fits into that frame?
Well, obviously there's a material difference, which is the Epstein accusers were children. And I guess not in every single case. He also abused adult women. But I think adds a level of gravity to it. But I think that one way to contextualize that I do think is relevant is, look, as a former Republican, am I the best person to say this? But I think a lot of Democrats would say this, particularly Democratic women. Like, you look back at maybe the Bill Clinton era of the presidency, you look back at how Democrats dealt with Epstein prior to, the latest revelations when Trump came in. I think some of them look back and say, hey, maybe we should have taken these accusations more seriously than we did. So that's not to lump Plattner in with any of those. Like I said, I think that this New York Times article, that there are some serious accusations from one person, and then the rest, depending on kind of your definition of serious, but nothing related to violence or nothing related to sexual assault or anything like that. And so, I think that Graham Plattner, obviously tonight, will have a chance to, kind of explain himself to Chris Hayes, and I think people should hear him out. This is not to say he should be thrown out, but I do think in the context of the Epstein story, a lot of Democrats can maybe learn from lessons and say we should take the accusations seriously. We should look at them. We should consider them and do what's right by people that are victims. And we should also, not throw the baby out with the bathwater because there are bad faith attacks against people. Like, that's a challenging tightrope to walk. And I think that's kind of the tightrope that Graham Plattner's on right now, about which kind of side of that he falls on.
I want to read a little bit from this New York Times story, which I've read carefully through twice, and this feels like it gets at both the allegations and his sort of political position. The New York Times reports this, quote, Graham Plattner, 41, a combat veteran, has spoken openly about grappling with his post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and drinking that he said resulted from his time in the military. As revelations about him have surfaced, including his dismissive remarks online about rape and derogatory comments about women, as well as a tattoo he had that is widely recognized as a Nazi symbol, he has said his past behavior does not reflect who he is today. Mainers, he has urged, should not judge him for, quote, the worst thing I said on the internet on my worst day 14 years ago. Obviously, some of these allegations are more recent than 14 years, if I'm doing my bad on live TV math. But some of this will be how voters and people who cover him, largely in Maine, assess the credibility of his response to this crisis.
For sure. And, you know, I got sober when I was 19, and there were things I did as a teenager that were not good. And, you know, that is why I got sober. So I do think people can absolutely change. And, you know, he was in a very traumatic experience. What's so complicated about this moment in American life is we have come so far as feminists in this country, and then we've had a lot of backlashes, including the second election of someone who has all these allegations of all sorts
He's trying to criminally investigate E. Jean Carroll.
Right, exactly. And so, and you know, we've seen, like, Roe v. Wade, which was the law of the land for 50 years, was overturned. So it's a very confusing moment to be a feminist, and it's a very complicated moment with how we as a culture grapple with this kind of thing. And so we've both gotten it right sometimes, and we've gotten it wrong other times. And so it's hard. But the good news is that it's really not for any of us to decide. It's for the people of Maine.
Graham Plattner, Democratic candidate for Senate in Maine, joins me now. Mr. Plattner, it's good to have you on. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
I just want to say at the start that, like, you know, we've had you on before, and I think you and I are both people that in other contexts talk about income inequality and healthcare and all those issues, which are extremely important, and we devote a lot of time to on this program. This is not, you know, the thing that we spend a lot of time chasing. But, you know, there's some serious stuff there I want to go through with you, and I think voters have a right to know about it. And I want to start with what Ms. Fifield says about being rough is the term the Times. And I'm going to just read you the account so you have it. This is from the Times. Mr. Plattner could be rough with her, Ms. Fifield said, particularly when they were drinking, leaving her shaken and sometimes afraid. In the interviews, she grappled with how to process her experiences. She was quick to note, he never hit me, he never punched me. She said he regularly grabbed her by the shoulders, sometimes hard enough to leave marks. On one occasion, yanked her out of a cab by her wrist after an argument in which she wanted to stay in the car. During one argument, she recalled he twisted her arm behind her back, shoved her into a bedroom, and held the door closed from the other side so she couldn't get out, telling her to remain there until she was calm. Eventually, Ms. Fifield said she fell asleep and left the next morning. It hurt, she said, but she added, it didn't cause any injury. It didn't break my arm. Did that happen?
No, it did not. There are some allegations in this piece that I just want to be kind of unequivocal about are simply not true. Anything alleging physicality, anything alleging that I knew what my tattoo was, these are the statements of someone who's politically motivated. In this piece, there's a lot about my struggling, not being a good boyfriend, certainly self-medicating with alcohol, and I've been very upfront since the beginning of this campaign that was a pretty dark period of my life after I came back from my combat service, and that's what that kind of life looks like. And so there are things in this that I absolutely will take responsibility for and have been speaking about openly for months now. But those serious allegations are just not true.
You did not grab her by the wrist. You did not put your hands on her shoulders. You did not push her into a room that you closed the door on. She's lying about that, is what you're saying.
Yes, that is not true.
You mentioned the tattoo. So I want to talk about that because I think this was troubling to a lot of people, and I think, again, your account of it assuaged some of that fear, clearly in Maine voters, as reflected, again, by reporting and polling. She says, same person, that you referred to the tattoo as my Totenkampf, which is the German word for this particular Nazi symbol. There's other reporting in Jewish Insider in October in which an anonymous acquaintance says you used that same phrase. Did you know what this tattoo was about before last October when you said you first became aware of it?
No, I did not. And I also think it's important to note that it's very likely, and I think that she is that same source. She's the person who's been telling people this from the beginning. And so I feel like, we're kind of rehashing the thing we've been through. I had that tattoo for 17 years. It's a skull and crossbones. I got it with other Marines who I served with in Iraq, in Croatia. And in the time that I had it, I got a security clearance with the State Department. I re-enlisted in the United States Army, where I was screened for gang and hate tattoos. And I took my shirt off in front of my family, many of whom are Jewish. We even released as a campaign a video, which you're putting up on the screen right now, of me dancing at my brother's wedding to his wife, who is Jewish, and her fully extended Jewish family. And I would not have taken my shirt off in that context if I had known. And so any statement saying that I did know is again, totally false.
I do want to follow up one place on this, and I don't want to get too forensic, but, the Times basically reported that they saw texts of hers, including a text in August, I believe August 3rd of last year. This would be before October of last year, in which she basically said that you had a, quote, Nazi tattoo, and she joked about how she's going to go volunteer for Collins. Now, again, this is a text that got sent, so, we can place the time, right? This is in August. How does she know it's a Nazi tattoo in August of last year, and you don't know it's a Nazi tattoo in August of last year?
Well, she certainly didn't send that text to me. So whoever she sent it to and was talking to, I can't say why, but I will say that I certainly didn't know, and the text messages she's sending to friends who may have recognized it, they didn't tell me that. So,
can we talk? I want to talk about the piece that came out before this, which was about what your wife had alerted your internal campaign folks to, and just to sort of stipulate to get out ahead that, I think some people view this as a real betrayal by your former campaign manager, and that may be true, and I understand. And I also watched the video that your wife put out, which I found incredibly compelling and moving, about what you've worked through. But just to be clear again on the details here, and there's obviously two subtexts here, right? This is you facing Maine voters at a primary and also a general election that's going to happen. We all know that, right? We're all on the same page. Were you sending sexually explicit messages to other women back in 2023, 2024, as reported in the piece?
So this is the first time in my life that Amy and I's marriage has been the interest of people besides Amy and I.
Yes.
And it's definitely a bit jarring, a bit strange. Yeah. It's also a marriage that is very strong and that I do believe we deserve some privacy in. I will just say this. At the beginning of our marriage, I made mistakes, and Amy held me accountable for them, and we worked through them. And the work that we did made our marriage significantly stronger. And who we are today is an incredibly faithful and happy married couple. Amy is my best friend. I love her more than anything else. And quite honestly, the hardest part about this whole campaign is I don't get to spend as much time with her as I like to. And so it has been it's been a hard experience to have gone through this together as a couple long before our lives were brought out into the public. And then to have it essentially outed by someone that we put our trust in, who then turned around and betrayed Amy's trust, and has now turned, frankly, our private parts of our marriage into a bit of a public political spectacle. It's hard, but it's our marriage. And it's a good marriage, and we're very happy in it and very happy with each other. And I thank my lucky stars every single day that Amy is my wife and that she has given me a lot of grace and a lot of love over the years. And I'm a lucky man for it.
I'm here from you. You don't want to get into specifics and details, and I can respect part of that. But I do want to just make sure on the timeline, right? Because I think there's two things going through people's heads a little bit here, which is, you have talked about self-medicating with alcohol and being pretty messed up when you got back from the service and trying to figure out what you're doing and doing things maybe you wouldn't stand by now and saying things you wouldn't stand by. But this is 2023. And so there's a difference in the time. And I think the first question is when did this stop? If there was stuff that you're not proud of that you worked out with your wife and you don't want to talk about the details, when did it stop?
Oh, it stopped when it was happening. I mean, like, it was Amy and I, it happened soon after we got married. And we dealt with it very, very early in our relationship. And so that's when it stopped.
Are there texts of yours, pictures of yours floating around out there, which, again, maybe from a time capsule, but people, I think, are understandably a little nervous. Maybe you'll be the nominee, probably be the nominee for the Maine Senate on Tuesday. And then it's October 10th, and here's a text or picture of Graham Plattner that is not the kind of thing that you want to see. Like, are you worried about that? Are there texts like that?
I'm not worried about it. I mean, I went, as I've talked to him, I went through my life through a number of years struggling and not exactly acting with the best behavior. I've been very, very open about that. And if people would like to continue to drag things up from that time in my life, I'm sure that we are going to see at some point somebody attempt to do exactly that. Just know that these are things that happened before I became a public figure, before I got into politics, and it's a part of my life that I'm very happy to talk about and talk about the struggles within. And so I do think that as we move forward, you know, what we've built up here is really something quite spectacular. It's very new. And I think one of the reasons why it's worked so well is because I have been very open with the people of Maine. I go all over the state. I've held over 80 town halls, and I answer questions from Mainers regardless of what the question is. I've made myself very accessible to people, and I want them to know about my struggles because I firmly believe that if you believe in a transformational politics, you got to believe in the ability for people to transform. And my journey is one of transformation. And I'm very happy to talk about that earlier part in my life. And I have no doubt that people will attempt to continue to revisit Reddit posts, continue to try to revisit parts of my past. But I think what's really important to note here is that these are things that I talk about in my past, things that I'm not proud of, but it is a past that I had to go through to get where I am today, and I'm very proud of who I am today, and I'm very proud of the movement that we've built up here in Maine.
Just to be clear, just about revisiting, right? I mean, I think channeling concerns, I think, of Democratic voters and Democratic officials and a lot of people, right? That it's not a question of revisiting, right? It's new revelations, like vis-a-vis, texts or pictures. And I know you want to give some privacy in marriage, but I really do feel like I need to get these answers from you, which is like, the people you were texting with, whatever that was, in whatever context, they were adult women. You knew that, and it was consensual. Is that true?
Yes.
And you have that you confirmed that. You knew their age.
Yes. Oh, God. I mean, yeah. Yes, of course.
We're following new allegations this morning against embattled Democratic Senate candidate Graham Plattner. The New York Times spoke with several of Plattner's ex-girlfriends, some of whom claim the Maine politician was, quote, volatile and toxic during their time together. The Times writes Plattner could be charming and charismatic, they recalled in interviews, but also demeaning to women and, in at least one case, even physically threatening. One of Plattner's ex-girlfriends, who has worked for conservative groups, recounted their relationship from 2013 to 2015. Quote, Plattner could be rough with her, she said, particularly when they were drinking, leaving her shaken and sometimes afraid. She was quick to note that he never hit me, he never punched me. But she said he regularly grabbed her by the shoulders, sometimes hard enough to leave marks, and on one occasion yanked her out of a cab by her wrist after an argument when she wanted to stay in the car. It's important to note the Times also spoke with several other former girlfriends who gave a different account of Plattner, referring to him as, quote, a gentle giant and super kind. Plattner himself joined MS Now last night for an exclusive interview to address the story.
There are some allegations in this piece that I just want to be kind of unequivocal about are simply not true. Anything alleging physicality, anything alleging that I knew what my tattoo was, these are the statements of someone who's politically motivated. In this piece, there's a lot about my struggling, not being a good boyfriend, certainly self-medicating with alcohol, and I've been very upfront since the beginning of this campaign that was a pretty dark period of my life after I came back from my combat service, and that's what that kind of life looks like. And so there are things in this that I absolutely will take responsibility for and have been speaking about openly for months now. But those serious allegations are just not true.
This is just one of the big stories we've been following all week. We'll break it down with our panel. Co-host of the Nobody Knows Anything podcast and former spokesperson for the Clinton campaign, Jesse Larick. Also with us, Republican strategist Ashley Davis. She worked at the White House as Homeland Security Director in the George W. Bush administration. Thank you both for ending the week with us. I think first we start with you, Jesse, on this question of Graham Plattner. You knew it had to come to you.
It's so nice that I'm not explaining something right now.
I feel like Republicans often have enough to explain. We'll get there.
No,
but look, I think for Democrats, I have heard two things, and I wonder where you fall on this. I've heard from Democrats who say that this is a smear campaign meant to come before the primary in an election that Democrats have been thirsty to unseat Susan Collins in. And then I've also heard from Democrats who say this is really serious and the party needs to adjudicate it, despite the fact that they feel he could be a good opportunity to flip the Collins seat. I mean, where do you fall on this? How do we make sense of it?
I mean, I think it's unfair to just call it a smear campaign. I think it's clear that there are questions about his character and his credibility. And, you know, this adds to that. It's an uncomfortable situation for Democrats. Obviously, this is a must-win seat in a, you know, the entire control of the Senate might hinge on this race. So, you know, I understand why Democrats are loath to throw him under the bus and, you know, at this point in the race. At the same time, you know, I think we have to acknowledge that he has a credibility problem that's building at this point. You know, I didn't find his interview with Chris Hayes terribly affirming last night. He didn't seem super contrite. And so I worry about it, you know. Still, I would say I don't think a charismatic adulterer with a drinking problem is a novel profile for a U.S. senator, unfortunately.
Yeah, but at the same time, right, in an election cycle, and I have had Democrats say this to me as well, Ashley, in an election cycle where Democrats will make a ton of hay, rightfully so, about Ken Paxton and his history in Texas, what do you make of the main profile that Graham Plattner is cutting right now? And I think you're right. There are Democrats who say, well, if voters don't care, how can we be the ones to adjudicate this? But for Democrats, they're kind of testing how big is the tent. And for Republicans watching, what are they making of it?
And we were talking about this in the green room because Swalwell was out like almost instantly when his allegations, but they were different.
Yeah.
They were much different. I don't think this is a campaign ender for him at all. I mean, this article was supposed to be devastating. Obviously, it's not good. But if I'm reading that and I'm living in Maine, I'm like, oh, he's got mad ex-girlfriends, too, and see if it's right or wrong. I mean, whether it's correct or not, or if they're just ex-girlfriends.
Yeah.
But he's explaining, and the problem is it's a drip, 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 drip of negative stories about him, and he doesn't want to be explaining right now. He wants to be attacking Susan Collins, right?
Yeah.
And she's kind of like low drama. So for her, Maine's probably like...
There was a really fascinating split screen, I thought, last night of Plattner here explaining on this story and Susan Collins being congratulated for taking her 10,000th consecutive vote in the Senate. And I wonder...
That's going to be a campaign ad, I'm sure.
Right? I mean, but you know what these campaigns look like. I mean, what does this story turn into? Even if this is the last shoe to drop, and I think many of us have been warned by various strategists of there's more to come, there's more to come. If this is the drip, 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 what it looks like through November, what is the state of play then in Maine?
See, I have always felt that she survives. She survives every time. The only thing she cares about, right or wrong, whether she's a Republican, Democrat, or her constituents, she will not do anything. And that's been her reputation. I always thought that that's going to be a really hard seat to flip.
And then Democrats at the same time are saying, well, Trump, with all of his allegations and scandals attached to him, is in the White House. They're trying to say, you know, that makes the bar lower for someone like Plattner, and yet these are the very things that they attack the president on, right? Like, it's a very complex situation for Democrats to be in.
It's definitely complex. I would say I do not think there's a an equivalency between Graham Plattner and Donald Trump or Ken Paxton. I think with both Paxton and Trump, I have a bigger problem with the fact that they are crooks than with the fact that they are adulterers. And the last thing I'd say about the 10,000 votes, I think Graham Plattner would rather be talking about populist economic policy than his ex-girlfriends, but I don't think that he minds a split screen where Susan Collins is being, celebrated for taking her 10,000th consecutive vote. He's running very much against the establishment, and she hasn't delivered the things that Mainers want. And so I think 10,000 votes, he's keep talking about that.
Yeah, and you're here too long.
Exactly,
also, one of the very things that pushed what would have been Plattner's opponent in the primary out in the minds of voters, at least, was the idea that she would have been the oldest senator sworn in if she were to be elected. And it was the idea of establishment versus not. And so I think that is going to still be a thread. You're right.
Right. And it still bothers me that the best person that Chuck Schumer thought that he could recruit in this moment after the Biden fiasco in 2024 was an octogenarian, a soon-to-be octogenarian sitting governor. I just don't think that's the moment we're in.
Yeah, a misreading of the tea leaves, perhaps.
Do you think she gets in? Back in?
I don't. She said the other day, I'm still on the ballot. I was like, well, then make the case. I think the best case scenario at this point is let the Mainers vote on both of them. And so I don't understand why she wouldn't, go all the way in. This sort of 50-50 thing where it's I'm on the ballot, but I'm not really campaigning.
Split votes.
Maine voters, I think, are fascinating. So we'll watch how they vote. And I'm interested in hearing, we've got some folks on the ground who are going to talk to voters. I'm interested in hearing that sound as they get it. But then the other thing that I'm watching, if we're looking at how votes are going, is what's been going on in the U.S. Senate. And the Republicans that have been willing, at least on some of these amendment votes, certainly in the House when it comes to an Iran war powers vote, Ukraine funding, there have been some moments of breakage for Republicans that have been very much in the party line with the White House, now showing a little bit of, I won't call it an independent streak, but an ability to break ranks. And I wonder what you make of it.
Well, I think that this is because we're very close to an election. And so you can see that depending on where these senators are from in regards to states, so you saw Ohio.
John Husted.
Yeah. Yes, he voted last night with the Democrats. And then also Sullivan, he's in a tough race. So I think it's more to do with the election coming up than it is actually Trump. But listen, Trump keeps throwing these things in there every week, every couple of days that are just not helpful to some of these Republicans. And whether it's the Pulte nominate or, acting director, and we can go on and on. But in the ballroom and the
slush fund.
Yeah, but
we could go on and on.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just, I don't know if we'll see. I think the big break happens after the election.
After the election, and at that point, does it help them? Republicans' fortunes are tied to Trump here, whether they would like them to be or not. The economic numbers don't tell a great story. Democrats can exploit that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not terribly surprised to see this starting to happen as we get through primary season. I kind of always, these guys are survivalists above all else, and the biggest threat to their careers until June or whenever their primary may be is Donald Trump coming in and nuking them. And then you get through the primary, and you don't want to be bear hugging a president that's sitting at 35% approval.
Yeah, and I have been openly questioning at what point do they realize their political fortunes have to be handled by themselves, and that the president is not going to be swooping in to help them. But I think you're right. Those who are playing with a primary calendar that skews later just have to make different calculations as they're trying to answer that question. We will leave it there, though I could keep going. Jesse Larick and Ashley Davis, thank you both for joining us to end the week.
Mainers are in a difficult spot right now with this, and I think it's interesting to hear from those two voters, because it used to be not too long ago that Democrats, if somebody was accused of behavior like this, not too long ago at all, they'd be off the ballot or they'd be out of Congress. Democrats have ousted people from their own party for much, much less. How have things, or why have things changed, Alex?
Donald Trump. The Access Hollywood tape changed everything and established a new low in terms of toxic masculinity. And I would say that I'm not trying to draw a false equivalence between what's embraced on the right in terms of toxic masculinity and what's embraced on the left, but I do think it reestablished a set of norms and also established a threshold by which the American public would judge a president, right? The highest office in the land. And I think because of that, there are calculations inside Maine and inside the Democratic Party about, whether Plattner can actually really weather this and still win. And, you know, I don't know. The only people that know are the people that were being talked to on the street. This is going to be decided in Maine. And it is, I will say, Katie, as much as it is about Graham Plattner, it is very much about Susan Collins. Her mismanagement of Maine, her betrayal of sort of the independent spirit of Maine is what's fueling a desire for change, really strong change, powerful sort of warrior types, and all the good and bad that come along with that, I suppose. That's why Graham Plattner has been met with so much support inside the state. People are really tired of the status quo. Susan Collins took her 10,000th vote yesterday. That was seen as a I mean, I think we should salute people who devote their lives to public service, but it's also a testament to how long she's been there and how bereft Mainers feel about her leadership. And that's why Graham Plattner is in this race. They're going to be the ones that decide.
So one of the differences, and I know Plattner denied the physicality, but one of the differences we've seen between, and I don't want to make anything equivalent here, but I'm just going to generalize. When we're talking about Donald Trump or even talking about Paxton, and I know the allegations against Paxton are different, there's not a search for redemption. There's not an admission of, yes, I'm guilty of bad behavior in the past or being a bad boyfriend or doing things that I regret and I'm sorry for it and I've learned my lesson. What we're seeing with Graham Plattner is an attempt to ask forgiveness and an attempt to allow for redemption in his argument among the American public, acknowledging that there are dark things that happened to him. He was in a dark place. And saying that he's come out of that. I wonder what you think of this plea for allowing for redemption, which we haven't seen on the Democratic side very much of recently. And I know, Alex, you said it's in reaction to Donald Trump, but there was a time in reaction to Donald Trump where Democrats got very pure and very intolerant of bad behavior. You can just look at Al Franken in the Senate. There's now been a backlash to that backlash, and here we are dealing with Graham Plattner. Help me understand that evolution and whether there is now room for, or why there's now potentially room for redemption, Mark.
Well, I think it's problematic that Democrats, echo the notion that character counts for Republicans, but then when it comes to an issue like this, maybe there's a different standard. I do think voters are very forgiving and willing to allow people a second act if there's redemptive behavior. But there's problematic stuff. I mean, in that same New York Times report, a girlfriend claims that, that he did know all about the Nazi tattoo and he knew what it was. And that's different than what he said. I've been trying to think of what a resolution would be. And this is crazy Mark McKinnon thinking. But I mean, he's got to figure out a way out of this. He said there's no more stuff to come. Well, maybe there's a way for him to say, listen, you put together a committee of a few of the senators that I talked to and, a few key people from Maine. Do an exhaustive, deep dive, Rahm Emanuel, wet work kind of, examination of my record and any kind of flaws or character problems in my past, and let's just get it all out. A true vetting of me, and we have 4 weeks. Those that committee can meet and say either I've told the truth or I haven't. And if I haven't, then I'll raise my hand, take myself out, and Janet Mills can get on the ballot because you can do that until July 13th.
Alex, what do you think of that?
I know. I love you, Mark. You're a lunatic. First of all, I don't agree that he said nothing else is coming out. I mean, I watched that. I mean, if you watched the interview and you actually played some of the sound, Katie, I think he's trying to, take out some insurance against other things coming out and suggest that there's going to be more digging. He has a past that is very compromised. He is not the same person now as he was a few years ago, maybe even in 2023. I think we should expect more to come out. It's not a coincidence that these New York Times pieces and the sexting pieces are landing a week before the primary. I think, Plattner's best move is to keep saying, I am flawed, but actually you want someone who's lived through dark times. You want someone who understands pain pain and darkness and redemption, because that's the story of America. I mean, there's got to be some way to build in a narrative that fits the narrative of what Mainers are feeling with the life story of Graham Plattner. They got to be able to see themselves in him, which doesn't mean they all need to have the same allegations. But I think, the idea of forgiveness and empathy is something that he needs to very much bank on as he moves forward in this primary process. I don't think he has any intention of getting out. And by the way, I'm not sure Democrats in the state want him to get out. You hear these people talking, and they're not so sure he should leave.
We begin with Maine, where more than 500 Mainers joined a rally for Democratic U.S. Senate candidate Graham Plattner last night in his first public event since new allegations rocked his campaign.
Now, as every single piece of that past and journey gets dug up, litigated, and weaponized, you have my back. And to all of you out there, Maine, I will always have your back.
The Plattner campaign also announced yesterday that it raised more than $200,000 in the 24 hours since the New York Times ran a report about allegations against him by ex-girlfriends. In that report, 3 women who dated Plattner alleged, quote, toxic and unsettling behavior. One former partner, Lindsay Fifield, said Plattner regularly grabbed her by the shoulders, sometimes hard enough to leave marks. And on one occasion, yanked her out of a cab by her wrists after an argument when she wanted to stay in the car. During one argument, she recalled that he twisted her arm behind her back, shoved her into a bedroom, and held the door closed from the other side so she couldn't get out, telling her to remain there until she was calm. Eventually, Ms. Fifield said she fell asleep and left the next morning. The Times also reported that 3 other women who dated Plattner and now support his campaign described positive experiences with him and said he never made them feel physically unsafe. Thursday on MS Now's All In with Chris Hayes, Plattner denied any accusation that he had been physically abusive with a partner.
There are some allegations in this piece that I just want to be kind of unequivocal about are simply not true. Anything alleging physicality, anything alleging that I knew what my tattoo was, these are the statements of someone who's politically motivated.
In a statement to the New York Times, the Plattner campaign questioned Fifield's motivations, saying, let's be very clear. This is a lifelong GOP operative who's dedicated her career to electing Republicans. Fifield rejected that characterization, saying she has no connection to Senator Susan Collins' campaign and insisted that politics have played no role in her decision to speak publicly. She added, quote, I know it looks like a bitter ex-girlfriend Republican trying to take down a Democrat. It has nothing to do with that. If he was running as a Republican, I would be doing this exact same thing.
This is a tough one for Democrats. Yep. The thing that I think is really interesting is the difference between what's happening on the ground in Maine and what's happening in the kind of the larger Democratic ecosystem. The larger Democratic ecosystem, the folks that we talk to probably more than the folks in Maine, is they are concerned about kind of what's the next shoe to drop? Because shoes have been dropping since he jumped in. He told senators that there was nothing, even though the New York Times story was coming. And there's a question of if Democrats want to be the party that has the moral high ground when it comes to Donald Trump and other scandals, can they have someone who's scandal plagued themselves? Mainers seem to say that's fine, that at the end of the day, it costs more for Mainers to not have him on the ballot than to have him on the ballot. And I think that is something that's really interesting playing out here.
I mean, it seems to me that when you have a convicted felon who's been credibly accused of sexual
found liable
for sexual assault, sitting in the Oval Office, it sort of gives permission to lots of people who otherwise in other times would never have thought in a million years to run for office. Yeah. And I think to your point about the dilemma that Democrats find themselves in, they've got this flawed candidate. And we're going to find out soon enough whether Mainers want this flawed candidate to represent them in the Senate.
Yeah, I think.
Hold forth, Jackie. Go on.
Look, I think that there's certainly a conversation about whether or not, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, is there room for making amends in your life, a sort of a path to redemption. I think the question for Mainers at the end of the day is, do they want to be a part of that path that Graham Plattner is currently on? Do they believe that Graham Plattner respects women after reading that detailed New York Times dive? And do they feel like he's an honest broker? Do they feel like he's someone who is going to be transparent and be forthright with them after seeing sort of the track record of his claims over the past few months and whether or not they have amounted to the truth?
And people have over and over again, whether it is the New York Times when he did that podcast with them, or the senators said, is there anything else? And he keeps saying no. And that seems to be not true and kind of now unbelievable. And so the questions I think that journalists have is when we are always asking who are the kinds of people who are coming to Congress, who are the kinds of people that are getting more power here, it's a question of whether or not you can trust what they're saying. And at this point, I think there's a larger question of trust. And I know Donald, but I feel like you can have a conversation about him without having a conversation about Donald Trump.
Well, but the point I was about to make, and I know we've got to move on, but this might also explain why, to the whole point about is another shoe to drop?
Yeah.
No, there isn't, but another one drops. That's probably why Governor Mills only suspended her campaign. She did not drop out and keeps reminding folks, I'm still on the ballot.
I'm still here. You can still vote for me if you want.
Let's bring in MS Now congressional reporter Kevin Fry. He was actually at the Plattner rally last night. He joins us now from Bar Harbor, Maine. Kevin, what went down last night?
Yeah, I mean, we're outside of the event space from last night, which was pretty much at capacity for the evening. And one of the questions, as you were just kind of all highlighting, was, is the enthusiasm that we know has been building around Plattner, was it still there after this very kind of dramatic week for his campaign? And some of these folks that were attending, as they were walking in, we were talking to them, and they were kind of candid in saying, maybe not as much as a few weeks ago, but they still insist they're standing by their man. To touch on that one part that you were hitting on, Jonathan, I think at the table, this idea of, Trump is in office over the last decade. How has that changed the permission structures? And several voters, when I kind of brought up Trump, Ken Paxton, were very adamant, well, what Graham Plattner is accused of pales in comparison to what those two individuals are accused of having done. So here's just a sense of what we heard last night.
Well, I think, candidly, the Democratic Party's come up short in a lot of ways in terms of, whitewashing our candidates and being so morally elitist and kind of entitled at times. We have to be willing to get dirty.
His baggage is nowhere near their baggage. We're talking about people that are felons and people that take bribes.
I really kind of think that we all have skeletons in our closet, and we've all made mistakes, especially when we're younger.
And that was really a refrain we heard time and time again, this kind of redemption arc. We can, have faith and forgiveness, given that he might have changed his ways or improved his life. Now, the headliner last night, the man who organized this event, was Congressman Ro Khanna of California. And he's been very outright in saying that he is standing by Plattner, even though he says that some of the reporting from the New York Times this week has been toxic. He said last night to the crowd, there's no reason to forgive him for his past actions, or we cannot condone it. But basically saying the man stands for good things. We need to move forward. And so I asked him, looking at the prospect that he, is being bandied about as a 2028 candidate, if this Plattner experiment doesn't go right, if they lose the Senate race here in Maine, is that a punch to his credibility as a member of the Democratic coalition? And here's what he said on that front.
No one remembers endorsements. What they look at is your vision for the country, for your district. I think what matters is, are you willing to stand up for your values? I'm here because Plattner's for single-payer health care, because he's opposed to the war in Iran, because he's opposed to what happened in Gaza. And people will see that I fought for my values.
And I just wanted to specify that Khanna, during the remarks last night, said that no one should make excuses for Plattner's past. One other thing, as you all were touching at, this idea of Janet Mills, something to keep an eye on Tuesday night is there any sort of against Plattner, and what does that say about the path forward here?
Ms. Now's Kevin Fry in Bar Harbor, Maine for us. Thank you very much, sir. Get some lobster for us, please. Joining us now, senior Washington editor from Semaphore, Alana Shore. Y'all like lobster. And David Drucker, Ms. Now contributor and senior writer for The Dispatch. Thank you both for joining us at the table. Alana, I'm going to just start with you. The conversation we've been having, the thing that I've been focused on is like how different the voters sound than kind of like the Democrats that you talk to who are operatives in D.C. or who are running around the Hill. How do you explain that dissonance?
Well, I think a lot of these reporters are frankly fed up with the Trump administration. They see Plattner as a fighter. They kind of buy a lot of his brand as I will speak for the working class. I'm going to stand up to Susan Collins, who's a rubber stamp. And they kind of want to look past this more readily than some of the elected Dems.
Yeah. It's what does that tell us about where the Democratic voters are right now?
You know, I am not sure, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I think Graham Plattner, honestly, might be an outlier because he's young, because he's got charisma on a level that some other candidates might not have. This might be kind of a lightning in a bottle thing where Maine particularly, there's a lot of expats, some younger voters who might turn out relative to kind of the older electorate that Collins has benefited from in the past. It might not be replicatable, but it does potentially tell us something really important.
Yeah. Well, David, maybe the reason why Plattner has, at this point, staying power is because of something that Ro Khanna said at last night's rally. Let's watch this.
The character that really matters right now is the character to be willing to stand up to the powers that be. The Democratic Party, from Schumer to Sanders, is united with a single goal. We will defeat Susan Collins in November.
So that, to me, right there is the single biggest argument for Plattner. Democrats have blinders on. They're sort of, in a lot of ways, emulating what Republicans have done for generations, which is, this is my candidate. We need that seat, and we need that person in the seat to advance our agenda.
Yeah, you stole my line. I'm going to go home now. Okay. And what I mean is, what I was going to say is, for the past 10 years, a lot of Democrats have been perplexed. How can Republicans support Donald Trump given all of the ethical baggage, right? I mean, January 6th obviously became its own thing and was particularly egregious. But, in his history with women, his history in business, the fact that he doesn't always tell the truth. And we can go on and on and on. How can Republicans, we just talked about this a few weeks ago at this table, how can Republicans support Ken Paxton, who I have said maybe the most scandal-plagued politician I've ever covered? And the answer when you talk to Republicans is always, he fights. The other side is so bad that, yeah, I don't really feel good about how ethically challenged, my candidate is, but, what am I going to do? And then the other thing, and we heard that from the clip there in Maine that our colleague played, everybody's got skeletons in their closet. I have a quote like that from a Paxton supporter in Texas, verbatim from January, why they were voting for Paxton over Cornyn. He fights, and everybody's got skeletons. So I think what we've learned is that American voters, regardless of party, are all the same. They are angry at the establishment. They're worried about the future of the country. They're willing to look past the problems of their side because the other side is so egregious. And I think this is right now a sort of defining character of our politics.
Yeah.